Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Ukrainian talk show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and I would like to invite Professor Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show.
Whoop. Glad to be
Great.
here, Sasha. Thank you.
Hopefully, Ivan is going to join us soon, but if not, then on Tuesday for sure. We'll see. We'll see. So yesterday was another tragic development in this war, which is absolutely incredible situation. A small village of 300 people, where they were during the wake of one of the soldiers from that village who was killed in the war. There were about 50 plus people, maybe as many as 60 people. So it's 20% of population of this small village. And here, Russians strike with Iskander missile, killing 52 people, from what we know now. So it's all people. By the way, among killed is a wife of that soldier and their daughter, tragically. Now, on the other news, Biden had a very good, uh, nutritious breakfast today, and very soon he will have another good, nutritious lunch. How is dare he, with approval of the Congress and Senate and every Pentagon, to start sending the ATACMS missile, and he's the one man in the world who has to do the final step, and he is not making one. How that man can live and function like that? John, maybe you know better than I do.
No, I don't.
Uh,
I'll just be blunt. I don't. I'm not going to try to explain his actions. Really, I'm not. He because I do not know all the information that he is privy to, all the things that he has to consider. So I'm not going to sit here in independent judgment of the commander in chief based upon incomplete information. I simply will not do that. Now, what I can tell you, all I can do for you is describe the dynamic. Yeah, the Russians are obviously observing this. They are counting on political indecision on the part of the Western allies and hesitation, and their strategy has become perfectly obvious by now. It is to wait out the Western allies as much as possible, and hoping that political indecision and fear will eventually hand them the kind of victory that they are seeking, that they cannot possibly attain on the battlefield. From the Ukrainian perspective, the choice is now equally obvious. They have to be. They know that they have, in effect, a built-in time limit in order to achieve as much as possible an operational victory against the Russians on the battlefield. If at all possible, sever the link between Crimea and Russia, and basically render the Crimean occupation forces insupportable and untenable, so that they are compelled to surrender, and thus inflict a clear, significant operational defeat upon the Russian army. Those are the choices. The back of the political struggle ongoing is something over which obviously we have no control. So all we can do is sit here, observe, and from my perspective, I tend to go against the majority opinions of the so-called experts, of the experts that are observing this war. They are all saying that this thing is settling down to a stalemate, that the war could drag on for several more years, two or more years or so. I disagree. I think that once the link has been severed, Russia cannot possibly recover the Crimea after the link has been severed and the forces have surrendered. So then it becomes the momentum then shifts more and more to the Ukrainian side. And so in that case, the pressure then becomes upon the Allies to, okay, the Russians are back on their heels. The Ukrainians are doing even better than we expected. Let's go for it and complete the job and force the Russians to settle for at least an armistice. They're never going to settle for a treaty, a formal treaty, codifying Ukrainian independence. What what is within reach is forcing an operational defeat upon the Russian army, which in turn forces them to accept an armistice, however temporary.
Um, Jonathan, do you think that maybe Biden keeps the Atacams issue as a bargaining chip
It's
in his
possible.
negotiations with Republicans, with Europeans, with Ukrainians, demanding more and more speedy reforms? So he keeps it because you know it reminds me I was party to many years ago when I was in business, party to negotiations where there was supposed to be a substantial investment of one wealthy individual to a company. So there was already a meeting, room full of lawyers and CEOs and all kinds of, about, I'd say 9 people were present there. Now, this individual, he had a certified check for $100,000. As he once deal is signed, he provides a check, and then the rest will come later. So the lawyers are negotiating on both sides. Now, the check is right in front of him. Now, when something was discussed that he didn't like it entirely, he, with one finger, starts moving the check close to him. Now, when that issue was resolved, then he pushed it very easily, very lightly to a center of the table. Until such situation would develop that he probably didn't like something, he started very slowly bringing the chair closer to himself. He didn't say a word. He did.
It's subtle body language communication. I mean, it was very subtle, but the message itself he was delivering was quite clear. So
Absolutely. So maybe that's Biden is because obviously he's very experienced politician. He knows how things work in Washington and internationally. So maybe he keeps that as a bargaining chip because once he sent the Atacoms, he's losing very important means of to bargain with, right?
that's true. Once he's committed, and once the Ukrainians have the weapons in their hands, they can use as they have demonstrated in the past, all the way up in our experience in the war thus far. Any aid that the Ukrainians get, they not only make maximum use of them, but they often exceed the expectations of the givers. They say we didn't think they were, such as with Patriot. They employed Patriot even more efficiently than we anticipated they would.
Hmm.
So the Ukrainians are teaching the Western allies and their militaries some very interesting lessons. So, and especially the talk and the developments that Ukraine is developing its own military production capability and possibly potentially for export. That is certainly exceeding the expectations of the Western allies. They weren't expecting that. And so this is taking, in some cases, it's taking them pleasantly by surprise, and that the Ukrainians are showing development of more independent capability. And in other quarters, it's an unpleasant surprise because they did wait a minute, if they're developing their own capability, we're losing leverage. Think about that.
Absolutely. Well,
So,
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
so in any case, the Ukrainians are responding as intelligently and as cleverly as one could possibly expect, given the complexity of this situation. In a way, it's even more complex than the political considerations that I use that example again of the American Civil War, the calculations of Great Britain, and France. Should we intervene? Should we broker a peace? And the Confederacy was counting upon attaining a meaningful enough military battlefield victory that would convince Great Britain and France to intervene. And that meant, it did not mean sitting on defense in the South. It meant invading the North and inflicting a severe enough defeat that would be politically meaningful and demonstrate to Great Britain and France that they should step in and broker a peace. Now, that's a similar set of calculations, the same sort of calculations now ongoing between in the Russia-Ukraine war, you have an equally complex, if not more complex, set of military considerations because you have more actors involved. You have all the members of NATO whom Ukraine is, if they are as persistent as I believe they are probably negotiating individually with every NATO nation that is willing to listen.
That was the plan.
And that's the plan. Negotiate individually so that if the individual members of NATO see it as it being in their own best interest to supply Ukraine and help them win, they will do so. And Ukraine is counting on that, just as Russia is counting upon the fear and indecision with a fear of escalation within certain Western allies, particularly the United States, counting on that to weaken the resolve to continue supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia. So it's a very complex set of calculations. And right now, you're looking at the Western military experts, and I group them all as one big amorphous experts, so-called self-styled, new to the table, whatever, experts all competing for attention, and they're all holding their fingers in the wind, seeing which way the political winds are blowing, and say, oh, I think it's safe for us to say this. Oh, the Ukrainian counteroffensive is failing. And that seems to be what all the people sticking their fingers in the wind are doing right now. They don't see the Ukrainian counteroffensive being as successful as they would want it to be, or as they would expect it to be, and not realizing that simply the Ukrainians have successfully adapted their available means to what they have in front of them. So my response to this whole situation is very similar to what the former Chinese premier Zhou Enlai, when he was asked back in the 1970s, he was asked in an interview what he thought was the historical significance of the Napoleonic Wars. Now, recall, the Napoleonic Wars took place between 1793 and 1815. And Zhou Enlai's response to that question, well, what's the historical significance? His response at the time was, it's too soon to tell. That tells you a lot about the Chinese perspective. They take a very long view. The full historical significance often takes decades, if not centuries, to come out. And in this case, I think the full significance of the Russia-Ukraine war, it's not going to take centuries to play out. I mean, the impact may be felt for centuries. The immediate impact will take just a few years to become apparent, because the immediate interest for the NATO alliance is all too clear. You do not want a decisive Russian victory in the Russia-Ukraine war, because that just invites another war. Regardless of what the other pundits say, Russia will not simply be satisfied with crushing Ukraine and occupying it and committing genocide. They will just they'll basically say to the rest of the Eastern European members of NATO, all right, that's done. You're next.
Well, as an empire, Russia cannot stop fighting further wars, period. It's a way of existence for Russia. Because think about what they really bring to the world today, except death, all kinds of weapons, prostitution, very important part, and corruption. What else is Russia bringing to today's developed world or undeveloped world? Just anybody. These four things, that's what they're bringing. So how to exist if Russia, even without sanctions, Russia cannot continue to exist because very unproductive workforce, what is there, the lack of technologies, they're just very backward country, unfortunately, too large one. And so without the further expansionist goals, Russia as a country simply can't exist. This is unfortunately what it is.
So here we sit, waiting waiting in the middle of these developments. And I look back at histories of the Second World War, and looking at the histories that were written after the fact, where you had unlike at the time, you had the perceptions and the actions of all actors available that were being written down and captured in historical record. And so, really, if you look at it that way, it would have been extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, for anyone at the time to accurately predict what the course of events was going to be in the Second World War. So it only becomes apparent after the fact. So just as we have this now taking place, we have to resort to what I call what if analysis. What if certain assumptions take place? And right now, the biggest what if, Sasha, is I keep forgive me for sounding like a broken record, but the biggest what if that is going on right now is, what if the Ukrainian counteroffensive attains its clear and necessary objective of severing the link between Crimea and Russia? That is what matters most in this particular context at this particular time.
And obviously, with ATACMS available, it would be so much easier.
The more weapons of any kind that the Ukrainians get, the greater the probability that this counteroffensive succeeds in the objective of severing the Crimea from Russia. And the Ukrainians will make absolute maximum use of whatever they get. And so they are exerting their greatest efforts right now to cajole their allies. It says, look, just give us we don't need that much more. Just give us a little bit more, and we can make maximum use of it. And so this is what we are looking at right now. And so you and I and Yvonne are obviously, we are in the minority, so to speak, of all of the commentators right now that are looking at this situation. And there's the bulk of the commentators are saying, "Oh, this looks like it's going to be a stalemate. This looks like it's going to have to be a negotiated peace." Well, there's no negotiated peace. Russia's already made that clear. I mean, their objective is victory, and their sense of victory is in accordance with their absolute sense of security, bezopasnost, without danger. In order for the Ukraine to be without danger to Russia, it must be virtually exterminated.
See, the problem is that Ukrainian nations today, 90% or so, believe that Ukraine must continue and eventually win this war. Number two, what kind of agreement you can imagine could be signed with Putin if, forget about Budapest Memorandum, it was before Putin became the president of Russia, but in 2003, Putin was already president of Russia. And Putin was signed a protocol with Ukraine to obey these borders at the time or so on. So if Putin breaks his own agreements, what kind of deal you can imagine could be signed with Putin so it would be kept for more than 10 days?
Yeah. Well, given the precedents that you have just cited, there is no reason to expect that that Putin would keep any type of so-called, negotiated peace, even an armistice, could not be considered reliable. Unless the only at this point, regardless of how the other Western allies might wish it to be so, there is no real clear path forward for Ukraine except the attainment of a sufficient degree of operational victory that compels the Russians to say, okay, we're going to have to cut our losses for the meantime. Let's agree to a ceasefire, agree to an armistice. And then you will have a situation very similar to that which has existed between North and South Korea for 70 plus years. So that it's not a perfect solution. No political solution is ever a perfect solution. I mean, it's unrealistic to think that you can solve the problem. That's one of the great American failings that we have, is we tend to look at foreign policy problems as like an engineering problem, and it has a solution. It doesn't. It doesn't have a permanent solution. You cannot make the equation balance. And so these are we have to concentrate on transforming what is a greater problem into a lesser, more manageable problem. That is the most realistic objective that we can expect in the 21st century.
By the way, interestingly enough, Putin had a big speech yesterday, so-called Valdai conference. And he mentioned a few times that Russia is not objecting the negotiations about bringing peace to Ukraine, but in his understanding, the peaceful negotiations with Ukraine means a complete surrender of Ukraine. That's what Putin means. He doesn't call it surrender. But what kind of negotiations could be when we already acquired so much territory? So you have to, first of all, to start with, you have to recognize that this territory is no longer yours. It's our territory. Okay. Now, we can agree not to continue to escalate and not to take further territories. For how long? For about 25 days, 35 days? How long you keep this agreement? So obviously, if Russia, under any circumstances, will have a possibility to refresh its armed forces, get some new ammunition and weapons and so on, they will continue the same, because this is the nature of this country. It can exist only by expansion. If there is no expansion, this country cannot exist.
They are like a shark, which is for its entire life. A shark must continually be swimming forward. If it does not, if it is ever compelled to stop, it sinks. It sinks and dies. So the Russians are just like sharks. They must continually be moving forward or they die.
In fact, the case could be made that Soviet Union, which was more or less empire, at least compared to Russia today, and they had very few conflicts, like armed conflicts. It's Hungary of 1956. It's Czechoslovakia of 1968.
East Germany in 1953 for a short period of time. Yes.
Oh yeah, if you want to go through all of that, the blockade.
Those conflicts existed, but the logic of the Soviet Union at the time was to brutally repress all such conflicts.
Absolutely, and blockade
without exception.
Blockade of Berlin in 1949. That was the primary case for U.S. to say that this is act of war, casus belli, if you wish. And they had a few nuclear devices. They could warn Russia in a very, very straight form that you end your blockade in 24 hours. If not, we are going to hit all your forces in Europe, and not only in Europe. And Stalin he was a brutal dictator, killing billions and millions of people, but he was very pragmatic, and I think he would definitely consider such a message, obviously.
At that time, and I admit this is in retrospect, but at that time, Sasha, at the time of the Berlin blockade, the U.S. did not have in place mechanism for mass production of nuclear weapons. They were, as one observed commentator put it, during that period of time, the U.S. had very few nuclear weapons in its stockpile, and in effect, they were shadowboxing with the rest of the world, pretending like that they had more nuclear weapons than they had when they didn't. And they had delivery vehicles, but not necessarily the number of actual working nuclear weapons that could be loaded and delivered. But in any case, so that's sort of a historical what if. It would not have been something that the U.S. could have enforced at the time. What they did have was airlift capability. They had a very superior airlift capability, and they finessed it very well. They simply kept up the supply operation into Berlin through the Berlin airlift, and they kept it up they kept it up for as long as it took for the Russians to say, oh, well, this isn't working. Okay, we'll stop.
Continue my thoughts about the Soviet Union. So basically, then it dissolved itself in 1991. So then Russia, it was at the beginning very, very weak under Yeltsin, and it still started the first Chechen war. Then the second one, already Putin was in power. And look at the Putin's record. It's one aggression after another. It's a second Chechen war. It's Georgia. It's and taking all its territories, and then it goes into Ukraine, annexion of Crimea, Donbass. I don't know if it's not occupation per se, but this is aggressive war to destabilize Ukraine. And eventually it was Syria next year in 2015. And somehow Putin felt that he is unopposed really by the West because the sanctions, let's consider the sanctions don't work. Okay, West didn't know about it in 2014-15 when it started first actions against Soviet Union, Russia, sorry. But today it's already obvious that sanctions have its serious limitations. So if you think that through sanctions you will bring Russia to peace, think again. It's not going to bring Russia to peace because they can exist under sanctions like this ones that we have now for another 55 years.
Yeah. Now, Sasha, if you are looking for a true center of gravity that Russia depends upon in order to successfully prosecute its aggressive foreign policy, and it's the same solution that I have talked about number of times before in this program, that the U.S. and NATO, the one thing that the Russians fear more than anything else, even though they won't publicly admit it per se, they fear the potential of American technology to neutralize the one thing that makes Russia a great power in its own perception. That is their nuclear missile arsenal. That the United States has the potential, which they have alluded to a number of times in the past, to have the potential to neutralize or block a Russian nuclear strike. And they were afraid of as much as 90% back in the mid-1980s. And now, with the success of Patriot, which they have been afraid of since the mid-1980s, with Patriot showing its potential on the battlefield for blocking nearly 100% of strikes attempted against it. If you integrate Patriot with an upgraded Space Force, and by upgraded Space Force, I mean give the U.S. Space Force a space fleet manned by Space Force personnel. Right now, the U.S. Space Force, according to open sources, is composed of 80 satellites. To the Russians and the Chinese, that is not a Space Force. That is a set of 80 targets which need to be disrupted by Russian and Chinese anti-satellite weaponry. So in order to make space more stable, you need a U.S. Space Force that has a space fleet. Where do you get the space fleet from? You buy it. You buy it. Go ahead.
Exactly. Technology is already there.
The technology exists. The means exist. All the Pentagon has to do is effectively say, through the contract vehicle process, whatever, say to Elon Musk, Elon, we would like to buy 12 of your Falcon 9 spacecraft, 12 of your Falcon Heavies, and 12 of your Starships. We will take them and we will add to them the necessary weapons, equipment, and crew, and create a de facto Space Force space fleet, which can fulfill not only several planetary defense missions, such as blocking asteroids, cleaning up space junk, monitoring and evaluating climate change, which is an easy lift for the Space Force. And you take that and combine that with integrating that into a global ballistic missile defense system in which the space fleet is armed with laser weapons, which we have, which can be integrated into those spacecraft, which could then conduct boost phase intercept of Russian and or Chinese missiles. and therefore, in the words of the late President Ronald Reagan, render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. Once you have that integrated system in place, then the Russians have lost their primary means of leverage over the US and the West.
Exactly.
Once that is done, Russia, I call it a no-kill strategy. That ballistic missile defense does not kill a single human being. It kills missiles. It destroys their leverage. It does not kill a single person. What it does do is it threatens to destroy the political leverage of aggressor nations such as Russia and arguably China, and possibly and other lesser nations. Their weapons are all rendered impotent and obsolete, and therefore they become irrelevant, which for dictators like Putin is worse than death.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I would like to mention is one article that I read and enjoyed tremendously, and it's I would recommend to anybody to read. It's from magazine Foreign Affairs. The article written by Robert Gates by the name The Dysfunctional Superpower. Can a divided America deter China and Russia? And he starts with assertion that never before United States faced a coalition of 4 countries, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, which are 3 of them are obviously nuclear powers, and another one is on its way to become a nuclear power. And if that will go like that for another, say, 20 years, they will have more warheads together than United States and its allies. And United States never in its history faced a situation like that. And then he goes on to describe what, in his opinion, should be done. I thought it was a very interesting article. Maybe we'll discuss it next.
While he correctly identifies the threat and correctly identifies, he apparently has whether you want to call it inaction or just simply overlooked it. My research indicates that the proper solution, the proper counter to this emerging coalition is global ballistic missile defense.
Absolutely.
Where the U.S. and NATO, combined with its allies, produces, for example, by the way, in this U.S. Space Force, with a space fleet, it could invite members of NATO to supply the crew, additional crew from there. And in there, it could be I could foresee a situation where you have members of the Ukrainian nation eventually, as they become invited to become members of NATO, or they could be invited to become allied members of the U.S. Space Force.
I'm not sure that you would invite necessarily Hungarians or Slovaks.
No, you get the point. Make it on principle that it would be theoretically open. We would not necessarily be actively using a quota system. Says, okay, we're going to have so many from each member nation, but if they have suitably qualified personnel, then we would be deemed valuable enough to be members of a U.S. Space Force space fleet. Then we would consider it. It's just that it would make it a multinational defense system, which would be far better than trying to enforce a world government type solution, which to me is just utterly unsatisfactory. So in any case, right now, all of this goes back to the central point we have here on the battlefield today. In the short term, the Ukrainian armed forces they see their own future success and independence in a battlefield victory. Just as arguably during the American Civil War, for one brief moment during the Battle of Gettysburg, the Confederates had made a breakthrough in Pickett's charge, and they were within just a few yards of the Union supply trains. And then they could see victory and independence looming in front of them. And then at the crucial moment, the Union counterattacked and turned the tide the other way. And so, too, here in the Russia-Ukraine war, the Ukrainian counteroffensive has the potential to reach for and determine its own destiny. by effecting that breakthrough, being able to sever the logistical and reinforcement link between Russia and Crimea, and thus impose a defeat upon the Russian armed forces that Russia's political leadership cannot conceal, cannot ignore, and cannot possibly counter. And so that is the crucial point that we must be. Now, I think one observer in the West has said that Ukraine has another 6 to 8 weeks of relatively favorable weather, and these next 6 to 8 weeks that are going to be exceptionally crucial for the near intermediate term course of the war in Russia, war in Ukraine. So we will be watching for that, and I would say there is a better than even chance that Ukraine will, in fact, attain its operational objective of severing the link. And should they do so, then you will see the tune changing on the part of all these Western military analysts that are saying, oh, the war is going to last for another several years. Yeah, right.
Excellent. Jonathan, I 100% agree with everything what you just said. Everything. If this strategy was successful under Ronald Reagan 40 years ago, about almost 40 years, and that broke eventually Soviet Union. So today,
because they could not. Gorbachev was told that there was no way that the Soviet Union could keep up with this SDI capability. They feared the potential of being able to neutralize the Soviet nuclear arsenal, and that was what compelled Gorbachev to repeatedly try to persuade President Reagan to give up SDI. I mean, that was why, because they saw if he kept up with it, their nuclear arsenal would be neutralized, rendered ineffective. What they did not fully realize was that SDI was primarily a research and development program. They were not yet actually building the capability. But the Soviets were so fearful of the potential of SDI that, as I told you before, they even saw Patriot back in 1985. One author saw it as being intended for the strategic defense, the strategic ABM defense, Protivoraketnoye obrony.
Yes.
Using that acronym in an article.
Do you remember when the United States made a decision to put Patriots in Poland?
Oh, and yeah.
What
the Russians saw putting them in Poland. The Russians saw that as an ABM system, an anti-ballistic missile system that could block their nuclear weapons, and that is why they were so terrified and that's why the Poles wanted them in there.
Well, the United States said that no, it's not against Russian missiles, against Iranian missiles. That's why they put it in Poland. So they will intercept them once they're crossing Poland on its way to the United States. So that was a very interesting story. Yeah. Jonathan.
Yeah, and the Russians were saying, likely story. Yeah, we know what they're supposed to do.
Anyway, it was very elegant. However, I wish Americans will be more forceful in formulating its foreign policy, and America now lacks strategic initiative internationally. Especially after their withdrawal from Afghanistan, they are on the defense all over the world, whether it's Russia or any other actors like Iran now is much more aggressive than a few years before that. So something must happen in the American foreign policy formulation and implementation. That's definitely, it's not satisfactory as of now. Jonathan, anyway, I wish you to have a great weekend. Thank you so much for participating in today's program, and hopefully to see you on Tuesday, same place, same time, with a great positive news. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody.